Good afternoon. The Right Honourable Patricia Scotland, KC, Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, Ambassadors, High Commissioners, speakers and distinguished guests. Welcome to this Back to Blue event entitled Ocean Acidification, a Threat to Marine Ecosystems and Economies in the Commonwealth and Beyond. My name is Gilad Amit and I am a science correspondent at The Economist here in London, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's event. Back to Blue is a joint initiative by Economist Impact and the Nippon Foundation, aimed at having a measurable impact on ocean health. The Nippon Foundation, founded in 1962, is Japan's largest philanthropic foundation. Its activities span a wide range of fields, including support for children, people with disabilities, disaster relief, the provision of humanitarian aid across national borders, and ocean health. Together, Economist Impact and the Nippon Foundation have been addressing and amplifying the issue of ocean acidification through the Back to Blue initiative. Thank you also to the Commonwealth Blue Charter for supporting today's event as our venue partner and enabling us to make use of this beautiful space. Unfortunately, the only souvenirs you will be able to take of it photographically are of us on stage, of the background and of the panels. Photographs of the artworks and of the rest of the building are unfortunately prohibited. This is the second event of this kind organised by the Back to Blue initiative this year. A similar event was held in Tokyo in February, focused on the challenges that ocean acidification poses to Japan and its neighbours and exploring possible mitigation strategies there. The scientific evidence presented by Japanese scientists at that event was based on research led by the Nippon Foundation. The conference has helped us strengthen the global ocean acidification network and provided a platform for further action and collaboration. The Back to Blue initiative has also launched a new report expanding on that theme entitled Ocean Acidification, Time for Action. The purpose of that report is to highlight the efforts being taken by national and subnational governments, as well as other organisations, to address the threat that ocean acidification poses to marine ecosystems. You can access the report online. I believe there is a QR code that is somewhere. There it is. Thank you very much. You can scan this QR code to access that report. The dangers of ocean acidification, which the report covers, are all too real. As humanity's emissions of carbon dioxide have risen over the past 250 years, the oceans have helped delay the worst consequences, absorbing up to 30% of the carbon emitted in a given year. In the slow-motion car crash that is global warming, the oceans have been the crumple zone, taking the brunt of the impact and giving humanity some time to survive. But that impact has taken its toll. The increased concentration of carbon dioxide in the oceans has already led to a dramatic rise in acidity, and this is damaging some of the ocean's cornerstone species, affecting the well-being of marine ecosystems, coastal industries, and the human communities that depend on them. Unless decisive actions are taken to stem emissions, that acidification will continue and those impacts will worsen. This is becoming, fortunately, increasingly well understood. The UN Sustainable Development Goal 14, SDG 14, calls for conserving and sustainably using the oceans, seas and marine resources. One of its key targets is to address and minimize the impacts of ocean acidification through cooperation at all levels. And therefore, the aim of today's event is to bring together senior government representatives, scientists, ocean experts and other relevant stakeholders from within and outside the Commonwealth to discuss this growing crisis. The discussions we will have will explore the threat that ocean acidification poses to marine ecosystems and showcase best practices that can be adopted to mitigate its impact. Marlborough House is an ideal location for this discussion to take place. Commonwealth countries are highly vulnerable to the adverse impacts of ocean acidification. Of the 56 Commonwealth members, 49 have marine coastlines and 25 are small island developing states. Between them, they account for a third of the world's oceans that fall under national jurisdiction and nearly half of the planet's tropical coral reefs. Recognizing the gravity of the threat, the Commonwealth Blue Charter has established an Ocean Acidification Action Group under the leadership of New Zealand to address its impacts and share knowledge about how to mitigate them. We look forward to hearing about their efforts and others over the course of the day. Once again, thank you for joining us. And now, to begin the event, I would like to welcome on stage Mr. Mitsuyuki Uno, Executive Director of the Nippon Foundation, for his welcome address. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Amit. The Right Honourable Patricia Scotland, KC, Secretary General of the Commonwealth. ambassadors, high commissioners, speakers, distinguished guests, good afternoon. After holding the first Back to Blue Ocean Acidification event this February in Tokyo, it is a pleasure to hold this event here in London. Lately, I have been getting invited more and more to events that connected the ocean to other fields. These include events that combine ocean and philosophy, ocean and design, ocean and education, ocean and food. And at these various events, I've noticed the emergence of a common phrase, ocean blindness. It describes a state where vital connections to the ocean have been lost, despite the fact that our existence itself depends on this connectivity. Ocean blindness can be interpreted in 3 ways. The first is ignorance, the lack of knowledge and understanding about the ocean. There is so much that we still do not know or understand, not even the experts. What I want to share is that the part of the ocean we have yet to discover is nothing but potential. If we weigh the positive and negative aspects, there are only positives because the ocean is a treasure trove of possibilities. Part of the work of all of you gathered here may fall into this area. It is work that can open doors to wonderful possibilities. The second meaning of ocean blindness is indifference. Without interest, there is no thirst for knowledge. On a positive-negative scale, it is a neutral 0. Multiply 0 by anything, and 1 still ends up with 0. To bring about change, the key is to see how many of these neutral people can take a positive step from 0 to +1. You are the nexus between the ocean and humankind, and you should take this to heart as your next challenge. Back to Blue also values this point. The third meaning of ocean blindness is disregard. You know there is a problem with the ocean, but you pretend it's not there. You know that you are in some way connected to this problem, but you look the other way. In short, you are turning a blind eye to something that you know is there. In positive or negative terms, this action puts something that was already in the negative further down the line. It is something that people who are deeply involved with the ocean, like all of us in this room, must never do. Today, I'm confident that this event will be an opportunity for all of us to renew our understanding of the state of ocean acidification in the UK, the Commonwealth, Japan, and the world. We may very well have just reached the start line of this problem. However, from the moment this conference concludes today, we can no longer ignore it. Let us take that first step to overcome the walls is ignorance, indifference, and disregard that make up ocean blindness. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mitsuyuki Uno. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland, KC, Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, to deliver her opening remarks.
Well, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends from the Commonwealth and beyond, it's my honour to welcome you to Marlborough House for this critical and timely event. And as Gilead says, you're not allowed to take photographs, but you are allowed to take notice. So I'd just like to point out a painting that you might not have noticed on this wall, because it is actually the painting of Queen Charlotte, who was, in fact, before Meghan Markle, the first black woman to come into the royal family. And not a lot of people notice her, but we're very lucky to have her painting here. And this house is really a house dedicated to women. The Duchess of Marlborough, it was the Queen Mother's grandmother's house, and then it was the Queen's house, which was given to us as the Secretariat. So I really want to say welcome to Commonwealth Home. But this topic is one of critical importance to us. So I would like to extend my gratitude to the Economist Impact and the Nikon Foundation for supporting this Back to Blue event, as well as the partners engaged in the UN Ocean Decade Action, Ocean Acidification Research for Sustainability, for their considerable efforts to make today possible. And I want to congratulate our Commonwealth Blue Charter Action Group on ocean acidification, and in particular, the Government of New Zealand as its champion, for highlighting the critical issue of ocean acidification across our Commonwealth family. Our Commonwealth of 2.5 billion people in 56 nations, spread across 5 continents and all the great ocean basins, is an ocean Commonwealth. And 60% of our community under the age of 30. 49 Commonwealth countries border the ocean. Our member states are stewards of more than 1/3 of the global ocean under national jurisdiction. Nearly half of all coral reefs and 1/3 of all mangroves are in our Commonwealth. And 2/3 of the world's small island developing states are in the Commonwealth. And the ocean is the most precious, life-giving, yet undervalued, under-researched, and recklessly exploited natural wonder of our planet. It has been silently absorbing up to 25% of annual carbon emissions, acting as a buffer against the full brunt of climate change. But this immense and silent service has come at a grave cost. Ocean acidification. Ocean ecosystems have already been pushed outside the pH envelope of their evolutionary history. And this is a profound and alarming transformation, which threatens marine ecosystems, coastal economies, and communities dependent on the ocean's bounty. Indeed, it threatens the very machinery of our planet. The stakes could not be higher, and time is of the essence. Urgent action is imperative, and under the Commonwealth Blue Charter, it is well underway. The Blue Charter illustrates both the intense vulnerability of some Commonwealth countries to ocean acidification and our collective power to address it. The most effective action we can take on ocean acidification is to curtail the CO2 emissions, and we are working with all our member countries to help them implement their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. These commitments deliver local responses which will aggregate to global impact, and our experience shows that action is far more effective when members of the Blue Charter's Ocean Acidification Action Group work with and team from one another and really learn what works and what does not work. And the policymakers' handbook, which is published by New Zealand as the Blue Charter champion, is a great example of this, offering vital guidance to all our governments. And building on this handbook, the Secretariat has worked alongside the Government of New Zealand to develop and to deliver training on ocean acidification, which has been assessed by government officials and policymakers from across the Commonwealth. So today's discussion will help us to identify what more we can do and what support the Commonwealth Secretariat can provide to tackle acidification and protect the ocean. But we cannot have a meaningful conversation about a sustainable ocean without being honest about resources. Current financing for the ocean is woefully inadequate and entirely misaligned with the severity of climate change impacts on ocean resources and dependent communities. Support for the ocean and the blue economy accounts for just 2% of the Green Climate Fund, just 1.6% of official development assistance, and just 0.56% of all sustainable development goals funding from philanthropy from 2016 onwards, and just 0.01% of all SDG funding from development finance. That is a disgrace. So our efforts to design and implement policy solutions is vital, but collectively we must redouble our efforts to leverage more climate finance for the oceans. And the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub is hard at work to achieve this, and it's now mobilised more than $316 million for countries and communities which would otherwise struggle to access the support they need. But that has come from just $6 million worth of investment. 6 million, and we have 500 million in the pipeline. Now, for 6 million to almost 100 million, that's not bad delivery. But just imagine what we could do if every country who needed a climate finance advisor had one, and they had an ocean advisor to assist them to make the right applications. So it's a tiny amount of money in the right place to make the right outcome. But we all must go much further if we are to achieve a holistic approach for climate adaptation financing, which is capable of driving the sufficient range and the scale of strategies the ocean needs. And it's not enough to simply document the harms that are occurring. If we are to turn the tide, we must learn together, we must work together, and lead together. I know that if we approach this discussion in that timeless Commonwealth spirit of ambition, unity, and action, we will help to drive forward the solutions and the actions that are so essential. Indeed, we have no choice, because the actions we take now will determine the legacy we leave for future generations. And so we've said it before, but if not us, then who? And if not now, then it will simply be too late. I think we can do this. I'm glad everyone in this room is choosing to be part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem. And I thank you in advance for all you're going to do to make sure that our oceans survive and that our planet is fit for our children and our grandchildren to live in. So thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary-General. Now that we have heard about the scale of the threat posed by ocean acidification and the importance of taking action, it is time to revisit some of the fundamental science driving this planetary transformation. So to guide us through the subject, I'm delighted to welcome onto the stage Steve Widdicombe, who's Director of Science at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory and an advisor to the Back to Blue initiative. Steve, if I could invite you to the stage.
Right, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today and lift the lid a little bit on the whole ocean acidification issue. Daunting task following a truly inspirational set of words there. I thank you for those. Really sets into place, the scale of the task we're facing, but the urgency with which we need to act. So, ocean acidification. Is that on the screen? Yep, on the screen. What, why, how bad, what next? So let's take a step back and let's have a little look, as I said, under the hood to the mechanisms of ocean acidification. We've heard that ocean acidification comes about because the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere is being absorbed into the ocean, and actually the ocean has been acting as our best friend for many years, at its own expense, I will hasten to add. We can see that the carbon dioxide, once it reacts with the seawater, with the water molecules, it creates this weak acid called carbonic acid. And what happens then is this hydrogen ion that you can see to the right-hand side there sort of disappears off from this molecule. And this is the little molecule that's causing a lot of the grief. This is what causes ocean acidification. This is the molecule, or the ion that actually creates acidity in our ocean. So when you look at pH, this is what you're looking at. You're looking at the increase in these hydrogen ions in our ocean. But it just doesn't stop at that. It actually goes around looking for carbonate ions and scavenging those. And it used to be thought that there was so much carbonate in the ocean that we could continue to put carbon dioxide into the ocean ad infinitum and that the oceans would just cope. The problem is that the supply of that carbonate into the oceans is a relatively slow process. And it certainly cannot match the rate at which we are putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and then into the ocean. We have managed to, through our ingenuity as a species, outstrip these natural processes and affect the entire ocean around us. That's quite an achievement, but probably one we really shouldn't be very proud of. So how fast is it happening, and is it really happening? When we started to do ocean acidification research some 2 decades ago, there was a lot of questions that, yes, theoretically the carbon dioxide will go in, it will create acidity, but is it really happening? Now, thankfully, there are a number of places around the planet where we've been observing the oceans for many years, and the importance of sustained observations and looking at the ocean and taking key measurements cannot be underestimated. It is so important. It's often not the sexy side of science. It's often considered to be the sort of monitoring that no one finds interesting, but it's that monitoring and sustained observations that allows us to generate the knowledge so that we can make better decisions in the future. And these oceanic time series over the last 40 years have shown us that, yes, the models were correct. CO2 levels have been going up, pH levels have been going down, bicarbonate up, carbonate down, just as we predicted, and at a rate that was quite alarming. These stripes, now I think many of us will be aware of the ocean warming and the climate change warming stripes that were produced recently. Well, we can do the same for ocean acidification. And in fact, Professor Finlay, who will be on the first panel, has been working on a project that has been developing methods to observe ocean acidification from satellite observations, to look at the whole of the global ocean. And these data have been able to demonstrate just how widespread and how rapid this problem is. So since the start of the Industrial Revolution, our oceans are now 40% more acidic than they were. And when you think, well, that's been a couple of hundred years, so that's relatively slow. Well, what Professor Finlay and her team have been finding out is actually over the last 40 years, half of that acidification has been taking place. So this is a problem that's not just been happening a long time. It's getting faster, and it will continue to get faster. We talk about international agreements and initiatives that are starting to recognize ocean acidification and bring it into the fold in terms of how they are considering their role in protecting the ocean. One such initiative is the OSPAR directive, which primarily came into being as a mechanism for protecting or reducing pollution in the Northeast Atlantic region. Well, this year they published their most recent quality status report, and for the first time this report contained a chapter specifically on ocean acidification. And what this report found was really quite concerning. First of all, ocean acidification is happening right across the Northeast Atlantic region and in the Arctic. However, the amount of observations, the direct measurements of ocean acidification in this area was quite frankly woeful. There were very few data sets being collected to allow us to really understand how fast this phenomena was happening in waters in the Northeast Atlantic, where we would have thought if there's anywhere on this planet where we should be able to monitor and know what's going on in the oceans, it should be here. But even here, our observations and our data are still woefully lacking. However, those data that we were able to identify showed a number of concerning elements. Firstly, those data collected in coastal areas show that ocean acidification in these regions was happening even quicker than the predictions and the measurements in the open ocean. Now, this is largely linked to the fact that there are a number of other processes in the coastal zone that add to the problem of carbon dioxide. They exacerbate the problem. So in the same instance, that's both extremely concerning, but also gives us hope. Because whilst the control of carbon dioxide is a global problem and a big problem that we are trying to tackle through UNFCCC, there are things that we can do at a local level in coastal areas that will have a directly beneficial effect on the rates of ocean acidification in the coastal zone. So it's not a question that, unless we can control carbon dioxide emissions, all is lost. Yes, that's a key part of it. But that's not to say there's other things we can't do to protect the systems, particularly those in the coastal area. We talked about, okay, so the chemistry is changing. Why should we worry? Will it affect biology? Well, yes, it will affect biology. And there's a number of reasons for that. And the first one is the fact that carbon dioxide and the chemical changes it elicits in the ocean have been with us since the creation of the ocean. Carbon dioxide is not a new pollutant that's suddenly been created and then put into the ocean. Organisms have evolved with carbon dioxide as part of their environment and part of their own physiology. And why is that important? Well, what that means is the door is open from a physiological point of view to carbon dioxide. So when you start messing around with the levels in the environment, there is an open channel straight into the heart of the physiology and the behavior of these organisms. So is it any surprise that we are seeing huge biological impacts from the chemical changes that we're driving? Now, one of the most obvious ones, and the one that gets talked about most, is the impact on calcification, the way in which organisms create calcium carbonate as a structure to either protect themselves or provide themselves with a skeleton. So we think about coral reefs, we think about mussels and oysters, we think about crabs and lobsters. Now, being able to build those skeletons depends on an organism being able to manipulate the chemistry to such an extent that it can deposit calcium carbonate. That becomes very difficult when the pH is very low. Also, if the pH gets way too low, the calcium carbonate that they lay down will actually start to dissolve, and sometimes start to dissolve more quickly than they can lay it down. So the picture you can see there is a picture of a pelagic snail, a pteropod, which has become a bit of a poster child for ocean acidification. The picture on the left is a nice clear shell, which is a pteropod living in non-acidic conditions. The one on the right is a shell from an organism that's been in acidic conditions, all pitted and dissolved. And that's the kind of effect these organisms are going to face. But it's not just about calcium carbonate production. It's about the energy required to just live in this environment. And if an organism is spending more energy in just surviving, it has less energy for reproduction and growth. And that means that the long-term survival of individuals and populations is going to be impacted. Reasons to act. Well, if the biological reasons aren't enough to scare you, then maybe we can kind of indicate why should we worry about biodiversity? Well, we know we're in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. We're in the next extinction event, and that's driven by a lot of things, not just ocean acidification, but ocean acidification is playing its role. And it was recognized that that was the case at the recent signing of the Global Biodiversity Framework as part of the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, as the Convention for Biological Diversity. And in fact, ocean acidification and climate change has its own target. And that target is to minimize the impact of climate change and ocean acidification on biodiversity and increase its resilience through mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk actions. What that means is that when the indicators get published at the next COP at the end of 2024, countries are going to have to demonstrate that they are taking into account in their biodiversity action plans ocean acidification and climate change. So the time to act is now in order to be able to meet the ambitions of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So if you don't worry about the environment, maybe we worry about money. Well, same again. Your pocket is not going to escape the threat of ocean acidification. Now, there are numerous estimates of how valuable the ocean is to human beings. And one value I picked out from the Ocean Climate Platform was that somewhere around $30 trillion a year could be attributed to the goods and services provided by the ocean. And that it could be a lot more than that. To be honest, the science of ecosystem valuation still is in its infancy, and the more we study it, the more riches we discover in the marine environment. And ocean acidification itself is predicted that by the end of this century, the global economy will be around $450 billion worse off every year, simply because of ocean acidification. Now, surely that's a reason to act. So what do we do? Well, we talked about the idea that ocean acidification is a car crash in the process. So what do we do in a car crash? Well, first of all, I would advise everyone, if you're in a car crash, take your foot off the accelerator, please, because it's not going to get any better if you keep pumping gas into the engine. So, as we talked about, we have to reduce our CO2 emissions. So renewables, zero carbon energy, carbon capture and store. We know what we have to do. We need to get on and do it. There's a lot of carbon dioxide already out there in the atmosphere and in the ocean and causing harm. We need to find ways in which we can actually pull that out. We need to think about how we protect those habitats that draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and out of the marine environment. Think about technologies that might be able to reduce the carbon loading in the atmosphere and in the ocean. But remember, when we do go down the road of new technologies, let's not do it blindly. We've made a lot of mistakes in the past. Let's make sure we do it from an evidence base. And I would argue that some of the aspects of CDR, carbon dioxide removal, there's a lot of work still to be done before we jump headlong into that as a full-blown strategy. And then the final thing, which doesn't get a lot of attention, is protect. We need to adapt, create resilience in the ecosystem so that biodiversity and us as humans are better able to resist the impact that's coming. It would have been greater to build these things into the system years ago, but it doesn't mean that it's not valuable to do that now. So stop, reverse, protect. Everything we've talked about should be based on sound evidence. We've heard mention of the Ocean Acidification Research for Sustainability Programme, a UN decade-endorsed programme, and we'll play a small film at the end of this presentation to show you how you can become part of that UN effort to bring science into action. Science has been going on for 20 years. More science needs to be done, but the key thing we need to do now is put that science to work. And we do that through a targeted 7 outcomes of that programme. And you'll hear more about that later. So in summary, ocean acidification represents a real and present danger to our oceans, marine life, and all of us humans who depend on the goods and services the ocean provides. We must slow down and stop CO2 emissions, first and foremost. We must find ways to reverse the trends of ocean acidification by protecting those ecosystems that are looking to help us and do that by drawing carbon dioxide out of the air. And we must protect what we already have, maintain that biodiversity and resilience in the system. We must use the science and the knowledge that we have to make much better decisions and ensure that those decisions are taken quickly and are put into effect. And we all need to play our part. Every one of us as ocean professionals has a role to play. Use your strengths to be part of the solution. So I thank you for your attention. I really look forward to the conversations we're about to have, which is very much about taking what we know and putting it to work. So with that, I would just like to show you a short film on the UN Decade Programme and how you can join this programme and initiative and be part of the solution. Thank you very much.
In 2021, the Ocean Acidification Research for Sustainability Programme was endorsed by the United Nations Ocean Decade. It sets out to provide society with the observational and scientific evidence needed to monitor, mitigate, and adapt to ocean acidification. Join us in broadening ocean acidification research and action around the world by delivering 7 important outcomes by 2030. 1. Quality data. The global science community will be equipped to provide the high-quality ocean acidification data needed. 2. Science to action. Specific data and evidence needed for mitigation and adaptation strategies will be clearly identified and provided. 3. Observing strategies. Long-term ocean observing systems will be co-designed and implemented by scientists, funders, and end-user partnerships. 4. Biological impacts. The impacts on marine organisms and ecosystems will be better understood and used to support the protection of marine life. 5. Future projections. Societally relevant predictions of the impacts of ocean acidification will be freely available. 6. Public awareness. The public will be more ocean acidification literate, understanding its causes and impacts. 7. Policy engagement. Countries and regions will routinely include measures to reduce ocean acidification in their respective national legislation. Time is running out. We need to act now. From individuals to global entities, every effort, regardless of its scale, holds significance. Join us and make a commitment to help deliver these 7 outcomes to tackle ocean acidification. Register your commitment at www.oars-commitments.org.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Thank you for the presentation and for the short video and for setting the scene for the coming panels so well. I'd like to invite the panelists for our first panel to come to the stage. We'll be beginning our first panel discussion for the day. It's entitled Ocean Acidification Action Plans and Policy Framework, a Global Overview. This panel will explore how a robust policy framework and effective action plans implemented in time can avert the worst consequences of ocean acidification. Let me introduce our panelists and invite them to the stage. Helen Findlay, Senior Scientist at Plymouth Marine Laboratory and Honorary Professor at the University of Exeter. Jessie Turner, Executive Director for the Ocean Acidification Alliance. And Nick Hardman-Mountford, Head of Oceans and Natural Resources for the Commonwealth Secretariat. Thank you all for joining us. I'll start with a question for Jessie, if I can. We've heard a lot about the importance of tackling ocean acidification, and I'm sure everyone in this room understands that point very well. How well is that point understood among the policymakers outside of this room? Where does ocean acidification fall on the global policy agenda? Is it high enough?
Sure. Well, I'll just quickly say thank you to you for moderating and hosting us here today. Thank you for the Economist Impact Group and Nippon Foundation for convening this and for issuing the report. I feel very honored and humbled to be here and take this issue very seriously, of course, as we all do, and feel all the more called to this work that we have together today, and really appreciate the remarks that preceded this panel. So the first question is, do policymakers outside of this room understand ocean acidification enough? The answer is absolutely no. However, I will say we'll talk about the specifics of that at a domestic level as we go in this conversation, but I would say internationally, the prominence of ocean acidification in international frameworks is growing, and that's large part to a lot of the leadership in this room over the last decade and beyond. The UNFCCC is a particular place that there has been more recognition of ocean acidification as a slow onset event caused by greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that's really important to note because that has implications for adaptation and financing responsibilities, as mentioned by the Secretary General in her opening remarks. There's also something called the Ocean and Climate Dialogue that has been created under the UNFCCC. Over the last several years, there's been an increasing attention on blue carbon, food security, and OA's relevance to those topics. I would say at the UN Sustainable Development Goal agenda, of course, we have Goal 14.3, which is to minimize and address ocean acidification. That calls for monitoring and reporting of different countries to report their monitoring progress. However, that is also not enough. We need to be highlighting the policy and the financing required to really respond to that information. And then finally, Steve mentioned the Convention on Biological Diversity and relevance to the High Seas Treaty that was recently signed, and really thinking about how ocean acidification has a bearing on implementation of those types of frameworks. So again, I think there is awareness of the relationship between climate, ocean, biodiversity at the international level. Ocean acidification is at the nexus of that, but awareness is not enough, and we really need to be moving into the actual implementation that is required for governments to be able to respond to ocean acidification in their EEZs and domestically.
Okay, and Nick, and then Jessie and Helen, feel free to respond to this. Do you recognize the challenges there that Jessie has outlined, sort of where we are and the journey there is still to go?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The ocean acidification has often been seen as a scientific issue. We need to know more. We need to do more science. We need to document these impacts. We need to gather more data, do more monitoring. And while that's hugely important, and there's many gaps in our knowledge still, we know enough. And this is, when we look at all the risk assessments, the IPCC and others, this is a high confidence threat to the ocean. So we know enough to act. The other thing I think that has paralysed action is knowing what to do. So even SDG 14.3 is very much just about measuring. So the move from measuring to action in the Global Biodiversity Framework is really significant. But as Steve highlighted in the presentation, the effects are different in different parts of the world. And so understanding what's happening locally and taking local action and building that resilience through protection and restoration of coastal ecosystems and the impact on local industries and livelihoods is key. So one of the key messages to take away is really that as local policymakers, there's a lot you can do to look at how ocean acidification is going to affect your country, your communities, and take action against it. Mm-hmm. And so the Commonwealth Blue Charter, which is an agreement by all Commonwealth countries to work together for a sustainable ocean. And as the Secretary General said, New Zealand champions the Ocean Acidification Action Group. Really, that New Zealand held a meeting in 2019 down in Dunedin in the South Island, together with the University of Otago and the National Institute for Water and Atmosphere. And we brought together from around the world a real mix of scientists and policymakers. And it was the first meeting I'd been to, I think Steve would agree, that really had that mix in the room in a meaningful way. And we had a very rich dialogue, which resulted in New Zealand producing this Ocean Acidification Policymakers Handbook, which takes through, with sort of a whole load of templates, all the actions that really need to be taken to get an inventory of what you've got, both in your ecosystems, but also in your policy toolkit to address it already. And then, how do you do the vulnerability assessment? How do you do the risk assessment? How do you do the gap analysis? And how do you bring all that together to prioritize actions? Because the reality is, across the world, there are 3.5 billion people who are considered vulnerable from climate impacts. There's over a billion in the Commonwealth, vulnerable from climate impacts, and ocean acidification is a major part of that. And unless we address this as a human problem, not just a science problem, we're not going to tackle it meaningfully. Mm.
Jesse, Helen, anything to add to that specific point? I'm happy to move on.
May I?
Please.
I'm going to. Well, I was just going to say, I think, when we think about the international frameworks, is awareness growing? I think the answer is yes. We're starting to see placeholders for acidification and in target setting and goals. I think, honestly, at the UNFCCC, I think there's still a big disconnect between the ocean community of people, that includes parties who are advocating for ocean issues, and the more traditional terrestrial climate people. And I think there's still a big gap in helping the traditional climate terrestrial people understand the relationship to UNFCCC responsibilities related to ocean mitigation and adaptation. And so while there is awareness growing, there's still a lot to be doing to make sure that those mechanisms allow the type of support that then regions and countries are useful to them in doing the things that Nick just described. So just underscoring the point that, yes, at the IPCC level, we have global trends of ocean acidification. We know that CO2 goes up and pH goes down, and that's a problem. And most people, as we've talked about, don't know after that what to do. They don't know that there's anything that can be done at a regional or local scale. And so, one, we need to be socializing what those actions are, the policies that can get them there, but to do that first, starting with what regional information is needed and recognizing that regional knowledge gaps on ocean acidification is an equity issue, and it goes right to the heart of the climate adaptation capacity building and financing needs. And so that really helps set the table for bringing us from the international space and what's needed to get us down to that local scale.
Okay. And Nick, you mentioned it's a policy question, but also it's often seen as purely a science question. So I would like to turn to a science question, and I might direct that to Helen, if that's all right. to many people, I think the idea, the message that they get is that ocean acidification is a problem that's been made worse by human carbon emissions, and that if we were to be able to stop them, among the many benefits would be this sort of this slowing down of the ocean acidification problem. How important is it that we tackle ocean acidification as its own problem rather than just one of the benefits that comes from stopping carbon emissions?
Yeah, so I think it's important to realise that ocean acidification is it's unequivocally driven by carbon dioxide emissions. And I think actually that's played really well for the policy side of things, because it's meant that we've been able to go to UNFCCC and COP events and actually say, this is carbon dioxide driving this. It's not greenhouse gases, it's not solar cycles, it's not something that we can argue about. There is clear evidence that the CO2 is going up, it's going into the oceans, and that's causing the acidification event. And so I think having that distinction and importance in understanding ocean acidification in its own right is really fundamental for being able to take that to the policy dialogue and actually be able to emphasize that point. I think it's also important to remember that many of the policies and solutions that we talk about also, we talk about carbon dioxide emissions as being the main driver and the main thing that we need to sort out. But you hear other solutions being touted around, and many of them just don't address the issue of ocean acidification. And a clear example I just want to highlight is solar radiation management. So you hear that maybe as being a potential solution. That addresses the issue of warming and global heating issues, and it would affect the ocean heating, and the oceans take up 93% of our heat. But it wouldn't stop ocean acidification. And that committed CO2 that we've put into the atmosphere is going to continue to acidify the oceans, no matter what we do to the atmosphere, unless we reduce those CO2 emissions. So I think having an understanding of that science and the concept that CO2 is really the only thing that's driving open ocean CO2 emissions is something that we need to keep clear in our minds. Having said that, in the coastal acidification areas, as Steve alluded to when we did the OSPAR assessment, for example, there's many factors that is when we can start to think about these local and national adaptation and mitigation options that we can start to look at and think about.
Okay, and not to use too many vehicular metaphors, but to what extent is this sort of a runaway train, that if we were to be able to stop carbon emissions, would, in the space of a few years, the acidification caused by those carbon emissions sort of stop and we'd be in a new sort of a new neutral, or have we done enough damage to sort of cause, to eat into that braking space?
Well, as Steve mentioned in his presentation, the thing that will counter ocean acidification is carbonate, and that's weathering on geological timescales. So we're already committed to a certain amount of acidification. If we were to stop emitting CO2 today, we would have already committed a certain level of ocean acidification. And it will take time, it will take those geological timescales for that weathering to buffer those changes in pH and actually bring it back to pre-industrial conditions. And I think we recently did an assessment for the British government where we were able to show that if you look at even the lowest emissions scenario going into the future, where we actually start to bring down the carbon dioxide emissions, the pH takes at least sort of 50 or so years to even start to have that tail coming back up again to where we are today. So there is a lag time of at least decades to centuries in terms of our commitment that we've already made.
Understood. I'm happy for anyone else to jump in if there's a point you would like to make. Otherwise, I can jump on to the next question. Nick, was there something? No. And then just another sort of little follow-up on that, Helen, if I may. To what extent, the oceans obviously contain multitudes of ecosystems and locations and climates. Are certain regions going to be more badly hit than others, or have already been more badly hit? Is there a way of cataloguing it, or is it sort of everywhere suffering?
I think everywhere is suffering, but we tend to talk about global averages when we talk about 1.5 degree or 2 degree warming, and the same is true for the sort of 40% decline that we've seen in ocean acidification, but that's the global average. And like any average, there's places where there's more acidification happening and there's places where it's happening at a slower rate. everywhere across the globe that we have data and observations for is showing that we're seeing ocean acidification happening. It's not like in the ocean where some areas are showing pockets of warming, pockets of cooling compared to the global average of warming. But we know that, for example, the polar regions, particularly the Arctic Ocean, have much less buffer capacity, if you like. So there's much less carbonates in that system at the moment anyway. And so they're much more like a freshwater system. If you add acid to a freshwater system, it acidifies much more rapidly. And so the polar regions, particularly the Arctic Ocean, is acidifying much more rapidly. In terms of actually the carbonate ion, interestingly, the lower latitudes are actually seeing a more rapid rate. The latest, there's a couple of papers came out last month actually that showed that observations and modellings match really closely for the last 40 years or so. And they're showing that the lower latitudes, the tropical regions, are seeing this decline in carbonate ions at a much faster rate than the polar oceans. So although the polar oceans have less carbonate, and that gives them their own challenges, they will reach this kind of chemical threshold, if you like, first. Actually, it's these tropical regions that are seeing a faster rate of acidification in terms of loss of carbonate ions. And that's important when we think about the tropical coral systems. They're thought to become a threat at a much higher level of carbonate than some of these other organisms. And in the surface zone. So I think there's kind of hotspots, if you like, of different changes. And then there's also hotspots in terms of areas of perhaps upwelling events. So what we see is that the deep ocean has higher carbon dioxide levels. Those are being upwelled onto coastal regions, the eastern Pacific, eastern boundary currents, so the west coast of the US, the west coast of South America, the west coast of Africa, for example, all have these upwelling systems, and that brings deep water up with the lower pH, so they're exacerbated impacts. And as, again, just referring to the OSPAR region, we know that even within the Northeast Atlantic, so local to us here today, we know that the shelves, the bottom waters are experiencing seasonal periods of this chemical change, which is actually potentially corrosive to some of these calcium carbonate organisms. And looking into the future, we know that we expect at least 30% of that surface area, just of the North Sea, for example, will become corrosive to some of these organisms year-round. And that's pretty scary that it's just on our backyard as well.
Right, it's not something affecting people far away, it's affecting people far away and
it's everywhere, and
people nearby.
I think that's where the global average is really important, but then coming to think about what can we do, we need to be understanding that local, that coastal environment to really be able to say, this is happening on our doorstep, what is it that we can really do to make a difference to this?
Understood. And then perhaps building on that point, I'll turn to you, Jessie, and then Nick. There are different geographies, but there are also different policy priorities in different parts of the world, different capacities.
Can I come in on the geographies thing?
Yes, please.
First, before we move on to policies, because the impacts are going to be felt not just where the science is worse, but on different communities. And so, obviously, tropical coral reefs, a lot of tropical countries are developing countries. They rely on those reefs, those ecosystems, for their livelihoods, their food, their protein supply. I mean, we're talking millions and hundreds of millions of people around the world. And then we even think about, those pteropods, the sea butterflies that Steve showed earlier, which are the main food for herring, for example, in the North Atlantic. In fact, I think the Norwegians' name for them, which I can't pronounce, refers to the fact that the psh sound they make is they're dissolved in the stomach acid of these herring, and when they eat them. And so if you collapse the pteropods, you collapse the fishery, and the ecosystem effect is there. Now, the Norwegians are not going to stop buying fish. But where's the knock-on effect in the global fish supply chain going to impact? It's going to impact those without the economic advantage of being able to buy fish. And so, whichever way we look at it, the economic impact is going to be on the global south. And this is another reason why it's absolutely hugely important that when we come to the policy, we're not just thinking about the science, but we're thinking about the impact on people. And countries are starting to recognise this impact in their nationally determined contributions. The NDCs, they submit to the UNFCCC and into their national adaptation plans. So,
I think that's a point very well taken, that not all countries are tackling this problem in the same way. The oceans are level, but not all countries' capacities to deal with the problem is. So I guess it would be interesting, and I suppose, Helen, you're the natural person to turn to on this, but do feel free to intervene. What are some examples, and we'll be talking about this in more detail in the second panel, but what are some examples of solutions that might work in one part of the world that might not work in another?
Can I precede that?
Yeah, I think go for it.
Only just, I want to underscore I really appreciate the point on vulnerability, and that vulnerability is more about dependence on a resource rather than it is necessarily about that resource's vulnerability to ocean acidification. Of course, it's both, but you have to take those things together. And I just want to highlight, just from a stat, we talk about, again, regional information gaps, that information is what's needed to then think about what are the most useful response strategies at a local level. And that's going to depend on, well, what do you care about and why? And what do we know about that thing where? And I just want to underscore that from this information gap, that the stat that I've pulled from IOC UNESCO and some publications in this room is that 70% of OA research is generated by researchers and on species in North America and European countries. And so that is a massive gap of knowledge when it comes to thinking about biological impacts on species that humans need and care about for various reasons. And I also just want to put in context, we talk about, not to be boring with the science, and I'm not a scientist, so I'm not boring. Rather, you can't blame me for gliding over the science parts. My point is, my science friends will correct me on this, but I think generally the idea is that you need, people will say 10, 15, 20 years of baseline development to determine, pH trends compared to coastal variability. And I just want to put in context the type of gaps, capacity gaps that we're looking at. We have places like the United States that has had an OA dedicated research program for 15 years that's been funded through Congress. Then, for example, we have places like Europe where we've talked about OSPAR and different regional seas conventions that have been doing 15, 20 years of monitoring work that is more coastal relevant, ocean basin relevant, and getting into the biological research on keystone species. Places that we all work with in the Pacific Islands, and I'll give this example in the Western Indian Ocean in Africa, this partnership with WIOMSA, which is the Western Indian Ocean Marine Science Association, WIOMSA, have an amazing OA monitoring project. We heard it about in that Commonwealth workshop that we were in 2019. They have 6 countries in the Western Indian Ocean that has some OA monitoring happening, sensors in the water, for now 4 to 5 years. And that has been interrupted, of course, because of COVID and capacity and getting out to be consistent with this work. And I think similar examples can be pointed to in other places. And I just mentioned that because when we do talk about, it's not just more science and research, we definitely agree with that perspective. It's targeted research for purpose, but really taking into account that it is, a really big capacity gap that has direct implications to management response, to be able to effectively have management response, because that's the information that's going to tell you, to Helen's question, what can you do about ocean acidification at the coastal zone margin?
And I think the point you make there is that the research shouldn't be solely limited to what is actually happening in the water, how many H ions are there in the water. Should also be about which species are being affected, who relies on those species, and sort of this broader web that needs to be examined, and dare I say, draw the conclusion that is probably not being examined enough in those parts of the world that are likely to be most badly affected.
Correct, okay. Yes, and there's the holistic way that we're thinking about responding to acidification is just not integrated in mainstream risk assessment, mainstream marine management, mainstream climate adaptation. And those are the policy places that we need to start looking at to make sure that we have information and that available information is integrated into those spaces.
Okay. I will return briefly to the question, Helen, that I was asking about some examples of what might work. Again, we're withdrawing ourselves back from the complicated, even more complicated, multifaceted world of the policy and focusing a bit more perhaps on the direct impact on the water in front of you and the creatures within that water. Are there examples of things that might work in one part of the world that wouldn't somewhere else?
Yeah, so feel free to jump in as well. But I think the most obvious one, when we think about the coastal ocean acidification effect, is that we know that local pollution, especially eutrophication events, can have a consequence on the ocean acidification impact. So eutrophication is a classic example. You kind of add nutrients to a system, you get a big bloom, that changes the oxygen. People think of eutrophication and they think of the oxygen deficit that results as a consequence of that. But actually, every time you do that, you actually change the CO2 budget in that system as well. And so you actually end up with a kind of oxygen acidification balanced system as well. And so if we aim to reduce the impacts of eutrophication, then actually alongside of that, we should be aiming to help mitigate against ocean acidification as well. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of something that very locally we can do with management strategies that are usually already in place. In a lot of places, we know to monitor for that. We know to monitor for harmful algal blooms that are responsible for that. There's a lot of satellite work that goes on to do that as well, which means that people maybe don't have to have that in situ technology to be able to go out because they can actually utilize some of these remote sensing applications. So there's kind of mechanisms like that. Even just things like we know that having different really healthy biodiverse systems is a way to keep the oceans healthy. Growing algae, for instance, will influence the amount of carbon dioxide in the system. So people are working towards looking at whether we can grow shellfish alongside algal setups together to kind of balance that system of removing the carbon dioxide from the system, or at least alleviating some of those impacts. So there's a couple of examples. I'm sure you guys maybe have a few that you're aware of, maybe the coral systems.
Well, I think you highlighted a good range of sort of interventions that can be made in the system, and then there's also interventions in wider policy around the impact on livelihood. So if I take some Commonwealth examples, obviously Climate Change Act is an obvious place to start to embed ocean acidification. The UK has done that in the Climate Change Act 2008, which highlights ocean acidification as a major threat. Wales actually also put it in their 2015 Future Generations Act. And the point it makes in there is that land-based action will have an impact on reducing ocean acidification, which is just the eutrophication point you were making. If you address agricultural runoff and poor farming practices, you're going to help restore the health of those coastal ecosystems, and that will have a benefit for ocean acidification. So I think that's a really important point. I think your point, Jesse, around where the data gaps are as well is important. While it's not just a science problem, governments to take action on this need science for decision making. Mm-hmm. They need to be collecting that right data that somebody can make a decision based upon. And so they need to build capacity in marine science and make sure they've got scientists who are trained and have access to the right equipment to be able to make these measurements. And that's often expensive equipment. So there's been work with the Ocean Foundation done to develop this, what we call GOA-ON in a box. GOA-ON is the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network, which is the collection of all the scientists around the world working on observing ocean acidification. And this is like doing what they do, but in a low-cost box that you can use anywhere. And they've really been rolling that out in a number of countries in the Caribbean, but also mainly in the Pacific. A lot of small island developing states who are using this to now measure locally understand their local acidification conditions, how that varies seasonally, how it varies between years, so they can really start to manage that problem. And one of the things we're now doing through the Commonwealth Blue Charter Ocean Observation Action Group, which is championed by Canada, has been supporting the Ocean Acidification Action Group by helping supply some of those systems through the Ocean Foundation to some countries. But we're now working with Canada and with the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation to develop what we call GEM in a box, which is the global eutrophication monitoring. So low-cost equipment for doing the eutrophication monitoring to go alongside the go-on in a box. So we can really address this problem holistically. So building the capacity in both having the people who can do the measurements and having the equipment is really key.
The name gem in a box is catchier than go on in a box.
I agree.
More open to misinterpretation, but catchier. You take me on to a different area I'd like to ask about, which is how good are countries on a national level scale at sort of putting policy proposals together? Because my understanding is that a lot of the early work in collecting the data necessary, developing the action plans, taking the sort of those early steps needed towards the goal were taken by subnational governments with perhaps more awareness of their local problems and fewer data sets to collect in a specific region. Where are we with getting national bodies?
Yes, and you know, Jesse has great examples of the subnational, particularly in the US, where it was these upwelling events and the fact they were getting worse and creating problems for aquaculture that really drove the change. But at a national scale, it's also being recognised. I think, I mean, the US itself has ocean acidification in policy, but it's more, again, about the science. But in some of our small and developing states, one of the advantages of a small government is it's easy to do things holistically. And so Fiji is an exemplar here. They have ocean acidification in their national adaptation plan and in their national ocean policy. And both of them really recognize it as a threat, particularly to sustainable ocean management, because Fiji's committed to 100% marine management as well as 30% protection. And so ocean acidification is something they've flagged, and they've got these go on in a box kits as well, and they're trying to work on it there. But they've recognised that in policy. Other countries, well, Belize has it in their nationally determined contribution, and I should say that nationally determined contributions really are a key vehicle that can be used here. We've just done an analysis of how ocean-based actions have propagated internationally determined contributions following the incorporation of ocean action in the Glasgow climate statement in COP26. And we've now seen all Commonwealth countries with a coastline, all 49 of them, have at least one ocean-based action in their NDC. The small and developing states, again, are leading the way here. About 75% of the actions we've seen are from small and developing states. Because they are actually large ocean states, and you know their economy is the ocean economy, and so it really matters to them. But missing ocean acidification from this is missing an opportunity, not just to flag it in terms of a national strategy, but also to gain access to climate finance to support your action on it. So it's really important to get this stuff into nationally determined contributions. And I would really encourage countries to do that. Yeah.
Now, Jesse, I just definitely want to get you in on this.
No, I think it's, I think when, even my brain, it's like, we all work on this so much, and it's like, well, it's this and it's that, and we need all these different things. And I think that's the challenge of this topic. You know, the biggest thing with policymakers, I appreciate that we're talking about science capacity training. We need to train we need to have more OA scientists in the world. You know, it's a small number of OA scientists that are practitioners in this space, and that's what a lot of the work of GoOn, the Global OA Network, Observing Network, OARS, and the Commonwealth has been supporting, and many partners like Ocean Foundation as mentioned. And from our perspective, and I'll share maybe a bit about the Alliance to put this into policy context, how we've been thinking about it, is that we also really need to have OA policy capacity building. We need OA policy practitioners in the world. They don't exist, you know, I mean, nobody considers themselves an OA policymaker or an OA manager, and that's of course because it's this, well, is it a climate issue? Is it a marine issue? Is it a terrestrial issue and a pollution issue? And of course the answer is it's all of those things. It's multi-sectoral, And so we are trying to build science that cuts across different different fields, incorporating that chemistry and biology and moving from just an ocean observing issue to coastal information for purpose. But we're also really trying to help policymakers say, what is the purpose of that information locally? What would more information at a coastal margin help you do differently? And that is really the big question that we're trying to ask with and build together with policymakers so that we can better target research for those purposes, and that then we can get those actions more baked in to the relevant policies when it comes to climate, marine management, sustainable development, et cetera. And so I just want to mention that, policy capacity building. I'll just say some of the big things, when we talk about what is OA information good for, the big things that we talk about through the Alliance, and I think this is very much through the Commonwealth OA handbook that has been produced, and also messaged through OARS, is that, we can document change and inform climate ocean risk at different scales. So that's a big risk assessment part at a domestic scale. Climate risk assessments, marine management risk assessments. If we don't have this information there, we're missing something. Then moving into assessing food security and seafood economies. So we all have these big blue economy plans. What does that mean? What type of information are we using to evaluate the sustainability of those economies? We think about best practices around marine management. There are things that we can already do, like have conservation efforts, different seasonal closures, marine protection areas, using marine spatial planning tools to consider how we're using the marine space. But would OA information help make those things better? If we know that one area is going to have more or better or worse conditions in different seasons around acidification, can we use our MPAs strategically and effectively to be more climate resilient in that context? And then lastly, we've talked a lot about reducing local stress and knowing where is local pollution making more of an impact around the coastal margins for acidification. Is that near a shellfish growing operation? Is that near a mussel farm? Is that near a meaningful reef that is highly or declining in productivity? And how can we make sure that we're really targeting that pollution control? And then finally, we've talked about nature-based solutions. We talk a lot about blue carbon as something that we want to measure and monetize sequestration potential of some of these marine habitats. There's also lots of studies showing that having kelp, seagrass, mangroves, salt marsh nearby calcifying entities like oysters, mussels, clams, or even coral reef can actually improve and increase the pH nearby for a period of time. So thinking about it's not just blue carbon, there's all this other benefit. So those are the types of activities that we're trying to really think about. How would OA information better inform that type of work? And so it is very complicated, it's multifaceted, but we really want to be bringing it down to this local action. From the policy side, I'll just say the Alliance, which I am the director of, was launched in 2016, and that was really in response, as Nick said, to the direct impacts of oyster hatchery production, ocean acidification on the west coast of North America. So we had several oyster growing operations in Oregon and the state of Washington that experienced for several seasons complete loss of their baby oysters in development in tanks. And they were just pumping seawater in, growing oysters in tanks in their hatchery, and we're finding that the oysters weren't getting past a baby survival age. And it was found because it was acidification. And so that launched this whole question of, well, gosh, what can we do about this? What is the research and the monitoring and the forecasting and the modeling that would change our practices here? And so that's the background for the Alliance, and we're really trying to call governments now into what we call creating these OA action plans, which is really a starting point to get our arms around all of these questions that we're grappling with. It's really to say, hey, policymaker, did you even know that we can do more than just reduce emissions? We need to reduce emissions, but there's other things. We want them to be able to take inventory of information available in their region. We want them to be able to chart out which resources they care about most and why, and do we know anything about the impacts of acidification? Thinking about the adaptation strategies that are most available, and then thinking about where in policy we can accelerate those strategies, and where we can go get money to do more of that. And so that's sort of the grand picture with our action plans, and it's all sort of novel governance. It's the idea for a starting point to really think about a hub for a focus on ocean acidification management and then figuring out where that lives in policy. And that's going to be different for every country for a number of reasons, which many of you probably know well better than I do. But just giving that overview of pulling this in.
And when you talk about the capacity building for ocean acidification policy, I'm curious what elements that includes. So you mentioned helping build action plans. Does it involve training? Does it involve the training of scientists to be equally good scientists and policy advocates? What elements do you think it could contain? And I'm happy to then go to Nick and then to Helen.
Well, I was going to say so much partnership like those in this room that you're looking at. So what does it take to have the policy capacity building? I mean, really, that is the experiment of the alliances to try to answer that question. And so you have these things like action plans, which is a framing device. We have an action plan toolkit. But going to governments and saying, what's your plan to address ocean acidification? Have you seen our toolkit? Is not that helpful. It's a step in a direction, but it's not that helpful. Everyone has multiple competing issues. And if governments are even thinking about climate change and understanding acidification as something that they need to be working on, that's amazing. So it takes a lot of time just to even get people oriented around this as a domestic management issue. From there, again, it is best practices. As we were mentioning, the states in the United States have pulled upon decades of research, both from the federal government and from themselves, to start thinking about the adaptation strategies that they're taking. So just a couple examples. British Columbia is a province in Canada. They have an OA and hypoxia action plan. They've lined out the biological research on shellfish and fisheries in their area. And all of that information is going to support their climate resilient fisheries strategy. So they're making sure that that information is directly connected to that policy framework and funded as such. The states of California and Washington, they're really thinking about how to model and better understand that local wastewater contribution, nutrients and even nitrates contribution to water quality in their area and how that exacerbates acidification. And then going back to the wastewater permitters to have increased regulation on that pollution because its effects on acidification and oxygen loss. And then other examples, as I mentioned, this co-location of kelp and seagrass near coral reef and near mussel farms. We have lots of examples of that in Maine, in Florida, and even in Washington state. And so those are just some examples, but it's really helpful to bring policymakers together in one room, as you know, and just share this out. It really has been socializing, and I've been quite surprised that at first when we launched, we thought, well, national governments care at all about what the state of Oregon is doing to better understand hypoxia's impact on Dungeness crab and how they're outfitting their seafood growers to monitor which areas will be better or worse for crabbing that season. And of course, the answer is, yeah, New Zealand would be really interested to know that, And so those are some of the information exchanges that we've tried to put out into the world through the Alliance. We've had amazing partnerships like those with Go On, like those with the Commonwealth Blue Charter. Yeah. We can speak to some of the trainings we've done, and really try to use these international.
I think one of the
frameworks.
key things you said though was that, and it got funded.
Yeah.
And the point is these action plans are a strategy document, and a strategy document both looks at the potential losses. Steve described the global losses, but there's local losses from the impact of ocean acidification that you'll build into that strategy, and then you'll look at the budget needed to address it and realize the cost-benefit ratio there, and get that money flowing to the projects. And for some countries, that means this becomes a priority for putting into a proposal to the Green Climate Fund. Yeah. For others, they've got national budgets that can support it. But the point is, none of this action is going to happen without the money flowing. And the Secretary General described, the very poor state of funding for ocean climate action and particularly adaptation in the global south. And so, really sort of getting this problem costed is going to be a key way to taking action. And that's one of the key advantages of action plans. The other is getting the right people talking to each other, exactly. As you said. One of the things we're doing next year is we're going to have the first ever Ocean Ministers meeting, the Commonwealth Ocean Ministers meeting. Because if you think, who's your ocean minister? There isn't one in most countries. but somebody's responsible for the ocean, which means the right people are not talking to each other between countries. So we're going to get the right people together in the room in the middle of, in sort of early second quarter next year, hopefully, and have that ocean ministers meeting to really sort of make sure these issues are addressed. And when we go to the heads of government meeting in October next year, there's a really strong statement on the ocean that has addressed these issues.
And presumably the Commonwealth Blue Charter, it's a priority for you to work on this science policy capacity building.
Absolutely, you know. So the Commonwealth Blue Charter has 47 Commonwealth countries actively engaged in one or more action groups. We've done training on the science policy engagement, but generally and in these specific areas. But really, again, it's got to move to now action.
Yeah.
And so last year at COP we launched the Commonwealth Blue Charter incubator. This year we're going to be announcing the projects that have been awarded. This is small-scale projects to kickstart action in Commonwealth countries. So the Gemini Box project is one of the ones that's got done. And we're going to be, and so we really want to expand that, get more investment into that incubator fund so we can get more projects going, scale them up, really start to make, all the things countries have been talking about for the last 5 years of the Blue Charter. We now want them to be able to actually do and get the partners and the finance flowing in to make that happen.
Okay.
So.
And Helen, what I'm curious about is whether you feel that the way scientists are seen in this space is they do the early part of the work, then they hand over the baton, and other people have the discussions, and then cite the scientists in the footnotes of their reports. And if that's the case, should it be that scientists are equipped to play a role throughout more of the process and running the other legs as well of the relay?
It's a difficult balance, isn't it? Because you can't have someone do everything. They're not going to be the best scientists in the world, and maybe not necessarily the best people to communicate or even talk to policymakers or understand the detail of the policy. I, by far, wouldn't suggest I know anywhere near as much as you two and most people in this room about the policy that goes on behind the doors. I've never been to the negotiating table. So I think what you need, and I think you both have alluded to, is this community and bringing together that community. So the scientists need to go out and do the research, but we need to feed into that discussion in order to be able to doing the research that is right for the policy that we need to implement. And I think, and we've said it, we know enough to make change and we know enough to put action in place. And so it's a responsibility for us to be going to the table as scientists and openly saying, this is what we know. Let's listen to what you have to say. Let's hear what the policy positions are at the moment. How can we negotiate that? How can we get to a win-win situation for as much as possible everybody in every situation? And actually bring the science to the table, bring the discussion, bring the policymakers and negotiators, bring the funders, and actually have those discussions in place. And it's great to hear that the Commonwealth are bringing those ocean people together. So I think some scientists are going to bridge that gap, not every scientist, and I don't think that's the place for science. But I think we do need to be engaging with the conversation in the right and appropriate manner.
And just a very, very quick little follow-up on that. This is obviously a very welcoming room to the threat of ocean acidification. Nobody who's opened their mouths has failed to mention that this is a threat and that this is important and worth taking seriously. Are these the kinds of rooms, these the kinds of conversations, the kinds of meetings you're in most of the time, or are there environments that you find yourself in where the science needs to be sort of explained from scratch and be told more convincingly?
I think acidification is one of these difficult scientific concepts for a lot of people to grasp, just the chemistry, and so we try not to dwell too heavily on the detail of the chemistry, but quite often I find myself either in a room where people understand it and understand that it's a threat, or they are protecting their own interests. And at that point, you kind of have to break down the barriers. You have to gain their trust, listen to what their issues are, to be able to say, well, these are the science bits that I think you need to know, to be able to then help you understand what it is we need to implement to make action happen that will then benefit everybody in this situation, to be able to implement action against acidification, but actually make the oceans healthier and sustainable for everybody.
Okay, and just to wrap up, I'll ask a variant of that to both of you quickly, if I can. are you operating in a world where everyone you speak to is convinced of this, or is there a lot of convincing that you need to do?
I'll say everyone, wants to do something about acidification, but the question is what and how and when, and I think I'll just quickly say that I love Helen's answer. I mean, I think OARS is a wonderful framework where, the UN decade, the science we need for the ocean we want, and that's really what the OA practitioner community, that's both science, managers, policymakers, I think there is a very healthy integration that's necessary to be able to answer that question for the acidification work. And then I'll just quickly add, as Nick points out, the funding streams, both international, we're talking about the UNFCCC, looking at GCF, GEF, UN development banks, we really have, that's why it's so important to be putting OA as part of these climate adaptation strategies, part of the climate adaptation knowledge gaps, part of the marine management strategies, so that we can demonstrate why this information is supportive of those goals and outcomes that a lot of these funding bodies are already mandated to support. And not that they're the only entities that can be providing funding for this work, but certainly have responsibilities too. And being able to point to that increasingly in policy and in our intention for climate adaptation is really important. But I think there's a great partnership, as you're probably seeing, between the science, marine management policy, and hopefully increasing finance body understanding of where this work needs to go.
Yeah.
Nick, if I can ask you to just
wrap up. Uno-san started off talking about ocean blindness, and I think ocean acidification suffers from that ocean blindness. In the Commonwealth, we tackled that head on in 2018 when a lot of our countries, particularly our large ocean states, said we need something on the ocean. And so we brought the Commonwealth Blue Charter to the heads of government here in London in 2018, and they unanimously adopted it and embraced it. And so the Commonwealth has been ocean visible really, since 2018, and there's been a lot of progress there. And ocean acidification is a key topic there. Everybody cares about the ocean when they think about it. So it's just keeping people thinking about the ocean, and keeping and helping them see not just the problems in the ocean, but that there's positive action we can take to address this. These are tractable problems.
Yeah.
So if we work together, because none of us can do it on our own, but if we work together, we can crack this.
Great. And speaking about not being able to do it on our own, we now have the floor open for questions, a little under 10 minutes. And I think Steve will also be given a microphone if anyone has any questions directed to him. This is what I've been told, Steve. If I could just ask you to please raise your hand, the team will get a microphone to you. And then when you have a microphone, if you could please say your name and your organisation and keep the question brief. Thank you, please.
Thanks so much for the fascinating discussion. So James Spurgeon from Sustain Value, a consultancy firm, deal in natural capital environmental valuation. So we're seeing a lot of interest from multinational companies and financial institutions in getting a better understanding of their impacts and dependencies on nature, natural capital, and their associated risks and opportunities. There are a lot of drivers coming through, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, requiring companies to look at these things, not just currently, but their future projections, and look along their supply chain. So I just wondered, there seems to be, I haven't heard much mention of multinationals and financial institutions and investors. I just wondered to what extent you're beginning to engage with them on this topic.
Yeah.
It's been really interesting, actually, that, looking at the finance sector and how they've started to come towards this topic. Back in 2018, when we started, finance was talking to philanthropists and NGOs. And then the insurance industry started to get interested. And we had the Ocean Risk Summit in Bermuda, and then the banks started to get on board. And last year I talked to a conference of asset managers. So it's really filtering through about what a sustainable blue economy means, what ocean risk means, and how do you tackle it. And I think TCFD, already now it's in operation, is going to be key for things like ocean acidification, which if you're investing, if you're a bank and you're exposed to aquaculture, lending or to fisheries, and lot of other sectors as well. These are going to be impacting you, and TNFD is going to multiply that manifold as well. So there is engagement. There's a lot of good thinking going on. Actually, there are things like Sustainable Markets Initiative, particularly engaging in that, and we are talking to the private sector as well. And there's also sort of new funds like the Outrigger Fund, which the Ocean Risk Resilience Action Alliance is setting up, which is going to sort of hopefully make these investments into small island developing states and help, sort of recognize how you deal with risk in these circumstances. Because actually, investment in the Global South is no riskier than investing in the Global North when you look at the data. It's just that the lack of visibility puts people off. And so it's how do you make that visible and make sure that money can flow from the markets.
Do you want a quick
Yeah,
follow-up?
I'll just quickly add, less on the natural capital side, I guess related, but more on the risk assessments and getting the insurance and reinsurance commission bodies to this conversation. ORA, which is the Ocean Risk and Resilience Alliance, has been doing a lot of that work. You're probably well familiar. And trying, there's also been this question about parametrics, right? So we think about product development. What are the parametrics for something like ocean acidification? Is it a long-term, slow onset event, or is it a shock event where you do have these upwelling experiences or seasonal changes that are quite catastrophic, but then aren't prolonged? And so, the coral reef example that everyone looks at is sort of wind speed and thinking about insuring different reef and then having, payouts to different from different products with that parametric. There have been conversations that I've been aware of or adjacent to thinking about what would something like that be for acidification or for changes of, warming, acidification, oxygen loss. Insurance commissioner's office at the state level have actually been thinking about this more across California, New York, Washington State, and thinking about that product design. I think the question is for whom? Is this for private companies like shellfish growers? Is this for a state? Is this for a community? And of course, the answer is it can be all of the above. And really thinking about how we get those partners more into this conversation with the scientists who can answer those questions, together is super important.
I think just there on the left, third in, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Daniela Schmidt, University of Bristol. Isn't this just a gigantic echo chamber? If you look at the UK's National Adaptation Plan, and that's the one I'm most familiar with, the term ocean acidification doesn't feature once. The ocean features very little. If we look at the climate predictions the UK government asked the Met Office to generate, it had sea level rise, but it didn't even have an ocean in those predictions. It wasn't of interest of anyone in government to ask for those. So are we not slightly naive here to think that people really care? I'm trying to be a little bit provocative.
Provocation achieved, I think.
I'm not the UK citizen on the panel, so I can maybe go first. I mean, not speaking to particularly, but I would say that is the challenge. I mean, from the OA Alliance, we want these action plans, and they say, great, we have the standalone action plan, but it's not present within these other strategy documents, like the adaptation plan, like a risk assessment, and even increasingly like a marine strategy framework directive, which I know is an EU directive, but I think has carries over in the United Kingdom from marine management. And so those are the places, I guess I can't speak to the intention behind the lack of that, but I mean, I think those are the places where we want to have ocean acidification, knowledge, risk, response be seen and made into action, implemented, and so those are the containers, I would say, from my perspective in the UK government, where there's opportunity to include more acidification, not just reference, but science for fulfilling the goals of those policy documents.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to speak for the UK because they're on the next panel. Although I will say that earlier in my career, it was DEFRA who funded some of the earliest ocean acidification monitoring plans and that got us started, like Station L4 that Steve showed on his map. But if you are in Maldives or Seychelles, which have 3,000 times more ocean than land, or Kiribati, 4,000 times more ocean than land, you care. you care deeply and passionately, because this is your life, your livelihood, and your children's livelihoods and lives. And so it is on the agenda. And it's just knowing what to do about it, I think, is the key issue.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Apologies, but there is a drinks reception after, and that's partly what that's for. This gentleman here on the aisle, please.
Gonzalo Alvarez from the United Nations Association. In terms of action plans and policy framework, one thing is to talk about central governments, and that's excellent, obviously. But another thing is the role of local governments, especially county councils, borough councils. How do you see the importance of that, especially because they are the ones with direct authority over local communities affected by this very issue at grassroots level? How do we connect science with those local authorities and the local communities? That's an interesting question.
Helen, if you have a response.
Yeah, just a quick one. I guess from a science perspective, we actually are working, we try to work locally. It's more effective, I find, to engage with the local communities, engage with the local council. We have quite a good relationship with the Southwest, many different stakeholders that allow us to kind of understand their needs and put in place kind of the science that would be useful for generating that. Around Plymouth, we've got a new natural capital investment going ahead. I think there's talk of investing in kind of making that a national marine, there's a national marine park, and so linking together the kind of the blue economy with the science and trying to understand that. I think, personally, I think that's the most effective way of actually making action happen. But in terms of legislation and activities, I'd hand that over to
I'm limited,
more
unfortunately,
experience.
only to Jessie, given we have running out of time. Apologies, Nick.
I'll just say it's wonderful. I mean, the Alliance has port members, county members, city members, and tribal governance. They're different sovereign rights in different locations around tribal and indigenous communities in the US and Canada that are members of the Alliance. Anyway, I mentioned this only to say you're exactly right. The levers of even the CO2 reduction plans are more often more aggressive at the city level than they would be at the national level. As far as wastewater treatment, that's usually county and city or port. And the port, even the Port of Seattle, as a member of the Alliance, has a whole kelp bed strategy where they're monitoring ocean acidification conditions and using kelp to meet their blue carbon goals, but also to really help monitor in Puget Sound and Washington State. So those are great examples. I think the question is, how do we, I think the buy-in is there. The management levers are probably stronger. It's just a question of how do we build capacity to reach out to those communities, and how do we get the right information there or support the capacity building. But I know there's lots of great programs across the board to get at that genre of governance practitioner.
Okay, thank you for that question. It'll tie in very nicely to the second panel with its local focus. Thank you all for your questions, and please join me in thanking our panelists for joining us. I think I will stay, and I think I will invite you all to return to your seats. Thank you again. Taking advantage of my ability to stand up and stretch my legs there for a little bit. Apologies that it's denied you. We will now begin our second panel discussion. I'd invite our panelists to come onto the stage now, and I can introduce them while they're sitting here, if that's all right. Deny them the grand entrance. This second panel is entitled Fostering Local Actions to Tackle Ocean Acidification in the UK, the Commonwealth and beyond. And in this discussion, we'll focus on the urgent need for dedicated national action plans, as was touched on in the first panel, and also address some of the damage that ocean acidification has already done. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. The Honourable Karen May Hill, Antigua and Barbuda's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, the Honourable Phil Goff, New Zealand's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, and Tom Pye, Head of Ocean, Climate Change and Science at DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK government. The closest thing we have today, I guess, to an ocean ministry or an ocean minister. So I'll start with a fairly open-ended question to each of you in turn. You all represent very geographically distinct entities that have a great interest in ocean acidification. I'd like to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Karen May, and then move down the panel. How significant an issue is ocean acidification for your country?
All right, thank you very much for having me on this panel and for the opportunity to share a small island perspective on this important issue. Let me begin where some of the previous speakers would have ended, pointing out the dearth of data in this area, and in some instances, a lack of global seriousness around the topic. Antigua and Barbuda is a small island state. It's an ocean state. We have 660 square kilometers of land space. We have 110,000 kilometers squared of ocean space. So we're a large ocean state by any measure, and certainly one of the largest in the English-speaking Caribbean. Our economy is 70% reliant on tourism. And the importance of coral reefs, for example, as a source of food because of fish, as a barrier to the ravages of hurricanes that we have more frequently been receiving with greater intensity in recent years, is something I think we all understand in this room. And understanding that there is this thing happening called ocean acidification that is impacting things like coral reefs and fish stocks is, of course, vitally important to us. Because if this continues unchecked, an economy like mine could actually be reversed, if not even wiped out with respect to how we engage. And so the short answer to your question is, there is no doubt that for all Caribbean states, this is an important topic. The question now is, how do we treat with it in the absence of data? And I suppose that will come later on. We know it's happening because the scientists told us this in the previous panels. It is happening. We know that it's happening at a faster rate, predictably, for tropical countries, which we are. And so we're not going to sit back and wait for someone to give us data. We're already engaged with ways that we are addressing it. My final comment, general comment, will be that what I want people to leave with at the end of my sort of presence on this panel is that countries like Antigua and Barbuda are not just happy to be the victims of all the negative data. I want to be able to share with you what we're actually doing, how we're actually punching above our weight to address issues that we know of, that we perceive, and hopefully invite all of you to partner with us to amplify those actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen May. Phil.
Yeah, kia ora tātou. Very significant. The area that New Zealand is geographically located in is Oceania, and as the name suggests, it's an area of vast oceans and small land areas, and therefore the ocean is an intimate part of our lives. New Zealand is a somewhat larger group of islands than the other 21 island states in Oceania. But just to give you an example, 2/3 of New Zealanders live within 5 kilometres, 3 miles of the coast. The coast is part of our existence. And we work very closely with our Pacific neighbours, and there's a degree of anger in the Pacific. Somebody asked the question in the last session, well, we don't seem to talk much about it here in the United Kingdom. I think in the Pacific there's a far greater understanding, but I would qualify that by saying still an insufficient understanding of all of the impacts of climate change, which is severe weather events, which you can see and are happening daily, sea rise level, rises in sea level, I should say, and if you're a coral atoll of 1.8 metres at your top point, that's going to make you among the first of the climate refugees in the world. Acidification gets less attention. It's at the forefront of the mind of policymakers in the relevant sections of government, but if you walked down the street and asked people about ocean acidification, not many could tell you about it in this country, in my country, and in anywhere in the world. And I think we have two big opportunities later next year where we can raise this. One is in Antigua and Barbuda, the Small Island Developing State Conference, and then later we have CHOGM in Samoa, the first time the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting will happen in Samoa. Great opportunity to raise the understanding and concern. So what are the concerns? Very briefly, we've heard already from you about the impact on shellfish. And shellfish are a really important part of the diet of New Zealanders and Pacific Islanders, and particularly our Indigenous people. There's the impact on reefs, and that will be in terms of the fisheries that they can nurture, but also the protection from storms and inundation. And then there's the impact on fish that nobody has talked about, and we're still trying to understand what it does to fish species to have that acidification, but we think it makes them more vulnerable to predators and less easy to survive. So for all of those reasons, it's hugely significant. And I thought if I can just end the quote, we think that science has discovered this problem and discovered that sustainability is necessary. But the Indigenous people of New Zealand, the Maori people, have the saying, and it goes like this: Toi tu te marae a tane mahuta, toi tu te marae a tangaroa, toi tu te tangata. And translating that, it means that if the land is well and the sea is well, the people will thrive. And the sea isn't well, and that is a danger to the well-being of people and existentially, ultimately, to our survival.
It's a powerful quote. Thank you for sharing that with us. Tom, and would you be able to give us a sense of the importance of ocean acidification in this country? I realise that we were discussing earlier that the sort of ministerial priorities are in a bit of state of flux at the moment, but you can give us a sense of maybe historically what has been the significance.
Yeah, I can, and just to say a big thank you as well to everybody that has spoken and for the organisers. There's a few things I think for us to say. I think one is absolutely it's important, and I hope that I can partially address the provocative question that was put to the previous panel. But probably the key thing for us to say is that we see it very much as part of the kind of broader ocean climate debate, and that means a number of things. It means how do we integrate ocean into things like the UNFCCC, which we've talked about today, and of course it means how do we in the UK address ocean climate issues like OA, and how do we implement ocean climate solutions like blue carbon, which we've also mentioned. So it is very much important to us, but we see it very much as part of that wider debate. And I hope that that's something where we've tried to be a kind of leading global voice through things like our COP26 presidency, where we put ocean very much on the agenda. I suppose for me as a policymaker, which is a kind of type of person that we've spoken about a lot today, I think the key thing for us is thinking about what is the role of government, or what is the role of a central government in dealing with something like this, which is highly transboundary and highly diffuse. And I think we wouldn't be shy to admit that that is challenging. Some of the traditional policy levers that would be ordinarily available to government are more difficult to implement. So regulation being an example, I think. That's not to say that there aren't things that we think government should do. There absolutely are. And again, I hope that we are at least doing some of those. So things around like funding the community, funding stakeholder groups, funding science, if not undertaking science directly through our agencies and our arm's length bodies. And then the other thing I just wanted to briefly mention was, obviously we've spoken a lot about carbon emissions, and absolutely we see that as the biggest thing that we need to do, but equally perhaps there is a more direct role for government in terms of tackling pollution, which we understand to exacerbate ocean acidification in certain contexts, and that's somewhere where perhaps we can have that more direct role that we can't have in other areas.
Understood. One of the, I guess, the ironies here in this question, and Nick and I were corresponding about this earlier, and Nick mentioned the preference for using the term one global ocean that we all share. And what the irony is that even though it is global, the solutions and the problems and the challenges are all hyper-local, as we were hearing in the first panel. I'm curious how that resonates with you. What are the sorts of challenges? Because some of the ones that you've mentioned are shared elsewhere. Are there some that either are particular to your country, your part of the world, or that require, that are particularly challenging to translate into action? I'm happy to go back along the panel in the same way, if that suits you.
That's absolutely fine. And I'd like to do sort of a challenge solution type response to the question, because I always tell my staff, if you come to me with problems and no solutions, what's the point of hiring you? So I want to start off with the first point that I made about the sort of data sets. We have, with the Commonwealth Secretariat, been working on, for the past couple of years, the establishment of a Centre for Oceanography in the Blue Economy at the University of the West Indies Five Islands campus in Antigua, the newest campus in the University of the West Indies network. And that centre received the university approval last year. Nick sits on the steering committee for that. And all being well, the first director for that centre should be appointed in the new year. Perhaps one of you in this room might wish to spend a year or two in the Caribbean, helping us to set up this program. But that centre will actually fill a gap. It will fill a gap in bringing to the region and also bringing together within the region persons who are researching in this area, persons who can actually research in this area, to assist Caribbean countries to be informed about what's happening with our oceans scientifically. So we don't have to wait on someone to come in and tell us. We can bring people in, use our own people as well, and together find solutions with the COBE, the Centre of Excellence of Oceanography in the Blue Economy. We invite persons to partner with us to make that happen. We have signed on to initiatives such as one that I'm particularly fond of, called the Bluefins Initiative. We're the first country in the Western Hemisphere to sign on to Bluefins. We have a population of 90,000 people. Every year we welcome about 250,000 land-based stay-over tourists and nearly 1 million cruise ship tourists. Most of these tourists decide to go snorkeling and scuba diving. And that, of course, has an impact on our reefs. But not just in the way in terms of people touching them and breaking off the coral, but also the sunscreens that they wear. So we have actually adopted the reef-safe sort of language, and our hotels are saying to our guests, we are reef-safe hotels. People actually like that, and we find that there's a positive effect on how that hotel markets itself, and we're proud of that. We were the first island in the Caribbean, we're proud of this fact, to actually ban single-use plastic bags and styrofoams. And now a recent expedition that I think, again, the Commonwealth Secretariat helped to fund, that was in our waters just a year or so ago, measuring plastic presence in the waters, found that there was not that over-concentration or alarming concentration of plastics in Antigua's waters. We're proud of that fact. And we have seen a marked increase in how our land looks, but also how the ocean around us look because of actions such as these. And our actions have now been mimicked across several other islands in the Caribbean. There's a third thing I can mention really quickly, the Elkhorn Marine Conservancy, which the Elkhorn is a coral that used to populate Antigua's waters. They've now been reduced by over 50% in the last 20 years. And this conservancy is working with scientists, local NGOs, and the government to actually replant corals. And by the end of 2024, they expect within the northeastern area of Antigua and Barbuda to have replanted 1.55 acres of coral. Might sound small to you, but for an island state our size, it's actually quite an achievement. And the success of that should help to feed other actions across. Internationally, we're known for it. So conference next year in Antigua, the SIDS conference, will be an important space for advocacy. But right here at the Commonwealth Secretariat, we've been working as the co-chair of the Sustainable Blue Economies Action Group under the Blue Charter to champion blue economy type issues, not just with the Centre of Excellence, not just with plastics, not just with coral reef development, but also in things like the bluefins, as I mentioned earlier on. And so I want to give my other colleagues a chance to speak, and so I'll leave that there for now as some examples.
Thank you. Phil.
Thank you. If the premise of the question is that the most important solutions are local rather than global, I want to disagree with that to some degree. We all know that the primary cause of our problem are global emissions, and that is a global problem created in our region largely by the more industrialised countries in the world. And until there is a working together of every country under the United Nations Framework for Climate Change and the United Nations Panel on Climate Change, we're not going to solve this problem. If we keep pouring more and more carbon into the air, then no matter what we do locally, we're pushing it uphill. So a big part of the solution has to be global. For us in the Pacific, it's got to be regional, because small nations, we need that collaboration to work together to find the solutions. And many of the solutions will be the same solutions, and where possible, don't reinvent the wheel, because that takes up a lot of time and it's not very fruitful. But I agree partially with the premise, because if you've got local data and you can show local impact, then that is going to mobilise your population far more than the generalisations that I've just been talking about. And sometimes, particularly in finding solutions, there are particular problems that you have to address in order to resolve it. So we've heard talk in the last session about blue carbon and the use of seagrasses and kelp and mangroves to absorb carbon emissions. I'll give you an example of a local problem in the city that I lived in and was up until a year ago mayor of. We've had overfishing in the gulf that surrounds the city. It's a vast gulf, but we've had bottom trawling and it's damaged the ecosystem, and we've reduced fish stock numbers. The impact of reducing fish stock numbers was we have a thing called a kina, is the Maori term. It's a sea egg, and the sea eggs live on kelp. When we diminish the fish population, there was nothing to keep the kina population under control, and they've created what we call kina barrens, deserts under the ocean. Equally, through rural land use, we've called siltation of much of our coastal areas that smothers the growth of your marine ecosystem. And in the urban areas, stormwater that's not treated properly will have the same effect. So in our case, there are local things that we can do and should do that will resolve the problem. But if you're looking, I think you've got to look at it holistically and say you've got to work globally, you've got to work regionally, and you've got to work locally. And if you do those three things together, you maximise the impact of what you're doing.
Tom?
Sure. So I guess to continue the theme around kind of challenges and solutions, I think many of them we've touched on already. So the kind of transboundary nature of the problem, the diffuse nature of the problem. We've also spoken about ocean literacy and the need to kind of communicate the impacts and raise understanding. I think one that we perhaps haven't spoken about so much is there's quite a crowded multilateral space, I would say, in terms of climate and the environment. And that can make it quite challenging for things like this to cut through. Clearly, there's a role for the likes of us there in seeking to change that. I suppose in terms of solutions, again, probably we've mentioned a number of them, but science is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest. So there's clearly a number of unanswered questions that we still need to explore, and as speakers have already said, a need for continuous monitoring and ocean observations alongside answering those questions. I think for us as central government, we would see some particular areas where we can hopefully help to drive solutions. One is using the convening power of government to bring together stakeholders in a way that perhaps others aren't able to. Another one is around awareness raising, so it links to that ocean literacy point and making sure that things like this get on the agenda, both domestically and internationally. Very much linked to that, there is our role in the likes of the UNFCCC. So we're going to have a strong presence at COP28, for example, where ocean climate will absolutely be a fundamental part of that. But again, even within that, making sure that the likes of ocean acidification are kind of seen and heard is clearly important. And then the last one that I'll just briefly mention, which again we've touched on, is around local habitat restoration and protection. So just increasing resilience more broadly to climate change, which we understand to have a kind of co-benefit, as it were, for ocean acidification.
Got it. And Tom, you were talking there a bit about the profusion of multilateralism, of different endeavours. One of the ones, Phil, if I can turn to you, we were hearing earlier about the Commonwealth Blue Charter's Ocean Acidification Action Group that was chaired or championed by New Zealand. Is that a process that you can give us an insight into what that was like?
Yeah, Nick was very helpful in explaining some of that before. We had the Blue Pacific Charter, or Blue Ocean Charter, in London at the CHOGM in 2018, and there were 10 working groups set up, and the one that New Zealand opted to take a lead on was ocean acidification. And the first thing we did, as Nick and one or two others have talked about, is we convened a technical working group in Dunedin in the south of New Zealand, and it was an interesting meeting. We had 45 experts there. We had government representatives from 17 different Commonwealth countries, and it did what a technical working group normally does. It set out the challenges, the information gaps, and the capacity issues. But most importantly, arising out of that, because you can have all sorts of working groups and then don't see anything as a hard product from it. I've bought the hard product from it. It's 68 pages, and it's the policymaker's handbook for addressing the impacts of ocean acidification. And I think it is a useful document. It sets out vulnerability and risk assessments. It sets out a gap analysis. It looks at practical strategies to address the problem. And most importantly, it talks about priorities, because there are a lot of things you can do. You don't have the resources to do everything. So what are your priorities? Both, the things that you will apply and the areas that you'll apply them in. I think significantly it created a baseline measurement framework, and then so we know what the level of acidification is, and then a program for monitoring that, so we actually have the data. I think you were talking before about the United States has been doing this for years. It's much more recent in our part of the world, but you need that local data because it varies from area to area. Then we set up pilot sites, I think in the Tokelau, in Fiji and in Kiribati, to actually implement those techniques. And an important thing that has come up in the discussion at the end of the last panel, we set out the need for initiatives to raise awareness and to engage stakeholders. It's very easy for us to say politicians aren't doing enough, but I was active in politics for about 40 years, and I know the most important thing that can move you as a politician is when there is a demand for the action from the people that you're dealing with. Your role is to establish the leadership to explain what's happening, but if you've got that demand, and you've got that demand in areas of the Pacific, then politicians will respond, because it becomes an important thing, it becomes a priority for them. So I think that's important, and maybe if I just finish up on just one example of the practical work that we did. We've set up, and New Zealand has helped fund the Pacific Islands Ocean Acidification Centre. And basically what this does, the instruments used for measuring are relatively small, not too expensive, but you need a training program for how to use them. So we've established the outline of training programs. We've then had inductions of trainees from right across the region. They've learned how to use it. We provide the resource, and then they go back and they monitor the progress. So it's not saying, look, we'll do this for you. It's we'll involve you, we'll give you the training, we'll give you the resources, but you are part of the solution. And I think that's been quite important.
Understood. Karen May, I want to give you a chance to come back on what Phil was saying about how, yes, this is a global problem with local solutions, but it's also a global problem with global solutions, or at least solutions that, if implemented in one part of the world, can affect those elsewhere. And I wonder how you feel about Antigua and Barbuda and your neighbours in the Commonwealth and outside. What is the sentiment there towards the need for the big industrial polluters in this space, big historical polluters in this space, to take action?
Well, there's clearly always the feeling in Caribbean countries that we are the recipients of all of the baggage that comes with climate change, while at the same time being the least contributors to it. We're just too small to make any impact with respect to global carbon emissions, for example. And that has always been a challenge for us. But I also think that we're also plugged into the international community. You know, we sit in the Commonwealth next to New Zealand, and Australia, and Canada, and India, and countries that have vast research capacity, and also a willingness, United Kingdom, and a willingness to share. And I think that we need to also make ourselves available to that resource. We need to tap into it, and that resource needs to be open to understanding where we are and what we need. And I'll say this to a room full of potentially academics, that we actually don't need another study with recommendations. We have many of those. Save the trees. Let's actually take a couple of those studies, consolidate them, and actually implement something from them. And you know, I've come across so many reports. I'll tell you, as someone writes a report for us, and they forgot to change the name of the other island, and you literally have somewhere along the line another country's mentioned that really was, they probably just did a find Anguilla and replaced with Antigua. We've seen this so many times, and it's actually a slap in the face because someone's paying someone somewhere to produce yet another report. I also like the fact that as small states, what we have is an agility that bigger states don't have, and we need to take advantage of that. My Prime Minister is literally a WhatsApp away. He probably doesn't want me to say that, but he is. And I'll probably see him shopping in the supermarket right next to me. You're not going to get that, any of you. I don't think you're going to see PM Sunak next to you in Waitrose shopping. So that means that we can actually take decisions more easily. We can actually impact our populations with quick decisions if we can use them efficiently. Now, what's going to inform that decision, of course, is going to be data and knowledge and capacity and so on, but also just common humanity. And I just want to say that it's a two-way street, that we have a responsibility, yes, to engage and to be open to that engagement, to read all the studies and actually have the desire to implement, but also the community needs to meet us partway. Recognize that we're doing things, let's upscale some of those things, and let's support the region, who is again not the culprit to some extent, to a large extent, to what we're experiencing, but the victim, but not a hapless victim, a victim who's doing things, and just need you to recognize that one, we're doing things to help us do them better or on a bigger scale.
I suppose this is an issue where the small island developing states have an enormous contribution to make when it comes to the data, because you cover such a broad range of ocean, and being able to collect that data and add it to the models. You might not need another study to be printed, but I'm sure if we can access it online, then it would be useful. So I guess that's a very valuable contribution that you can all make. Tom, I think all of the three of you have talked about the importance of public information campaigns. I guess Karen May mentioned the example of sunscreen, and Phil, you were saying when the public wants something and there is that demand, that need, that makes it easier to take action. How important do you think, Tom, is it to sort of raise public awareness? Because I think this room is not representative of the broader discourse when it comes to ocean acidification.
It's an interesting question. I would probably, what Phil said around kind of how do things get on the political agenda, I think maybe in an indirect sense, it probably is really important, because actually that's ultimately what's going to lead to kind of political change, and for it to be on the table at the likes of the UNFCCC and in an international environment. I guess in thinking about the impacts, on a very separate level, there's then a kind of real importance there as well, in terms of people being able to understand the local impacts and to do something about the local impacts. And I think that sort of links to what we've been talking about around it's a global problem and it requires a global solution, but it also has local impact. So I think you absolutely do need public awareness, but for different reasons. I think on the one hand, you need it to drive that global change. And political change, but you also need it to be able to respond to local manifestations of ocean acidification.
And then Phil, Karen May, any contributions on the sort of the need to inform the public? What would you like them to be informed of? Would you like them to be pushing for the kinds of changes to make it easier for you to get them through? Where would you like the public to be on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to start from the viewpoint of the public being aware of the problem and the cause of the problem for them to demand an answer to it. But that doesn't let politicians off the hook. Just if I can quote a personal anecdote, we've talked a lot about to do anything you need funding, and there's a lot of demand and a lot of competition for funding. And I found myself as mayor of our biggest city and needing to do something about climate change and not having the money to do it. And I could have put rates up by, 10% and I would have survived until the next election, but not beyond. And I thought, how do I do this? People hate paying rates into a black hole. So I thought, why don't we have a targeted rate on climate change? And then I went out and I got the interest groups together. I tried it the first year and the councillors said, no, we won't touch that. That's a suicide note. But we went out and we mobilised public opinion on it, and we set out what we would use the money for and why it was so important. And then we did polling on it, and lo and behold, they said, we hate rate increases, but we will pay this one because it's necessary. And then suddenly, from having 12 out of 20 councillors being opposed to a climate change targeted rate, I only had 2 out of 20, and we got it through at the same time as we were coping with the impact of COVID. So, it does depend on political leadership and going out there and driving it, but it needs a coalition of interests. So you need to have your business sector understanding it and being part of the solution. You need the universities and the schools to be doing it. You need the media to be well informed and acting as, they're never going to act as your agent as a politician, but they are going to say, yeah, that is a real problem. Let's do something on that. And I found that by getting that coalition of interests together, then you could raise awareness and you could get a positive response. But you need to do it in that order. If you just charge out in front and think, I know that this is the right thing to do and people will just believe me and have faith, you're not going to survive very long.
Do you share that sense?
I do actually, and I'll just say, so it's almost paradoxically that there is perhaps no one in the Caribbean who doesn't know the word climate change. I think even my 4-year-old niece knows the word climate change because they've all been through a major hurricane or storm in the last 5 to 10 years. In one decade, we had 3. And they're always linked to this thing called climate change. So we have a population that's very alive to its reality because for them it is actually existential. And also our appreciation of the ocean is something that is, I think, in the DNA of all Caribbean people. You stay from your veranda and see the ocean. You drive to work, you see the ocean. It's always there, whether it's the cruise ships coming in or it's you going swimming or eating fish or whatever people like from the ocean. And so education for us has been made slightly easier in the worst possible way, put it that way.
Understood. The outcome has worked out, but the way we got there could have been a lot.
But I will say on a high level really quickly that once that Centre of Oceanography begins to churn out the type of output that we expect it to over the next decade, we will also have, alongside the experiential realities of climate change, Caribbean-generated data around what's happening to our oceans and to our land, and to our mangrove, and to our reef, and put it all together. And we'll learn from New Zealand, we'll learn from the UK. And that's what I love about the Commonwealth, that ability to learn, the toolkits that are developed, that we can sit here. I don't have to do certain things because he's done it. And he can share that with me and I adapt it from what Fiji is doing. And that is what amplifies the power of small island states and amplifies the power of the Commonwealth.
Okay, thank you. I guess just one sort of concluding question for all three of you. We were discussing earlier how not all countries are sort of at the point where they necessarily need to be on the subject. And I wonder, because you all represent countries that have a particular interest in this space and are particularly affected by it, is there any advice, any words of warning, sort of as a concluding thought to anybody in the room, anybody watching this who might be curious about how to embark on this process or the need to embark on this process well and smoothly for their own country? Tom, you're nodding most vigorously, so I'm going to turn to you first.
Well, I might draw an analogy with a kind of, don't know what you'd call it, a sort of philosophy, I suppose, in another part of environmental management and environmental science, which is the waste hierarchy. So in natural resource management, there's a kind of well-established principle that you should reduce, reuse, and then recycle in that order. And waste management is at the bottom of that hierarchy, but it's part of it. And I do think, thinking about what we've discussed today, there is a parallel with ocean acidification. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think there is a parallel in that what we have recognised is that the number one thing that you can do is to reduce carbon emissions. But that is not to say that the local things that you can do around habitat restoration, around local science and so on are not important. They absolutely are. But that kind of hierarchical way of looking at the solutions is very well understood, I think, in the context of a circular economy and natural resources management. And again, I'm not suggesting it's a kind of one-for-one analogy, but I do think there's something in that in terms of encapsulating the view that there are different things that you need to do, but the number one thing is simply to reduce carbon emissions.
Phil?
Yeah, I think the whole context has changed. 40 years ago, when I first went into Parliament, environment was an issue on the margins. It wasn't a central issue. If you talked about sustainability, nobody would know what you were talking about. And over that period of time, but sadly lagging behind the need to change more quickly, there has been a growth in public opinion. And environment is, let me talk about our monarch Charles. He was regarded somewhat eccentric 40 years ago for saying the things that we in this room would now just accept and take for granted as being evidence-driven and well-founded. So the political environment has changed, understanding more about the issue, but you still need to have people at all levels of society that are prepared to show leadership, that are prepared to be evidence-driven, and if I warn of one thing, it's populist politics. Over the years, I think populism is as bad as some of the other isms that we think about, because it's not about leading people, it's not about following evidence, it's about finding a prejudice and appealing to it. So I'm not putting any names or labels to any of those things. You can work those out for yourself. But we need people to lead us that are evidence-driven and not vote-catching driven. But when you're evidence-driven, don't forget that you've still got to go out and persuade the electorate that that evidence is real and it needs to be acted on, and they've got a vested interest and they need to invest in it.
Thank you for the diplomatic answer there as well. And Karen, the last words to you, please.
Thank you. I just want to actually say a massive thank you, because creating opportunities like this for small states to engage is important. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen across my desk invitations to conferences for to send technical people funded by the government of, and understanding that although it may just be a few dollars for country A, it actually might be difficult for country B, and especially the number of events that take place as well around the world. And so I think what I want to encourage is not for persons to see us as nuisances always asking for and wanting, because as New Zealand rightly said, everyone has budget constraints. It's not unique to anyone, but it's not the same depth of it, but it exists for every country. Right here in this country, there are pockets of poverty, just as there are in the Caribbean. So I want to thank those institutions, those governments that have always supported small states, small island developing states, to be plugged into what's happening when these meetings take place. I'm sure for COP in a couple of weeks' time, there'll be great support for SIDS to actually get there so you can even engage with the sessions. And so I think it's important to say that, because I don't think it's said often enough. We tend to beat people too much. And I want to actually pause to say thanks, because I've seen how countries have helped. I know that there are countries that need to do more. I know that there are countries that are guilty of some of the challenges that we're facing and are seeking to address them. But I actually want to just pause and say thanks for what you're doing, but let's keep doing more of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And on that note, we have the floor is open again for questions. You saw how few we got through last time, so let's please try and keep them brief, and I'll try and keep your answers brief as well. Please.
Thank you so much. Dr. Stanislav Edward-Shmelev, the founder of Environment Europe Foundation, a think tank on sustainability. I would like to ask a question about, we talked about data availability and all these regional initiatives. Do we have a comprehensive ecosystem-focused assessment of all the different things that are happening in our oceans, whether it's regional or pan, or earthwide? There is an issue that we haven't tackled, which is plankton. I've just Googled to get the correct data. Apparently, up to 30% of all the CO2 emissions can be absorbed by phytoplankton. Is anybody monitoring the state of this little organism around the planet Earth?
Let's ask you that.
And just to
Steve, this is for you.
and just to finish off, to throw a little challenge to us all, a very tangible commitment that is perfectly feasible, to my mind, to try to regulate and steer and inspire our water companies to change their behavior and to stop polluting the coastal waters. Simple. But thank you very much.
Okay. I won't ask any of you to comment on how much plankton you have in your national waters, but would anybody like to respond on the sort of how good, I mean, we've heard from you, Cameron, already, maybe one of the other two, how good is our data collection? Do we have an inventory on any scale of what needs to be monitored, or is that data collection still a massive priority?
I think it's patchy. It's good in some areas, it's non-existent in others, but we're making progress in the right direction.
Okay.
And you need that data to actually, if you don't understand what your baseline is, how can you monitor whether you're making progress against it? So we do need that. But from my experience, I can only talk about the Pacific, we're embarking on that. We're doing it in New Zealand. We've now got 28 monitoring sites around the coastline. We're working with our local authorities, with our universities, and we're accumulating that data, and then that will tell us just how bad the situation is and whether particular options are better than other options at finding an improvement.
Okay, we'll just leave it there. Sorry, Tom. Anybody else with a question? Please, in the aisle over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that really very interesting panel. My name is Inge Relf. I'm Executive Director and co-founder of a foundation called Global Choices, because the choices we make now, of course, will determine where we go in the future. The question I have really is you mentioned that, of course, emissions is fundamental. We have to really curb those. The second thing I would suggest is that we have to think about the frozen bit of the ocean, because I've just come from the Polar Summit, Macron's Polar Summit, and it's absolutely terrifying, the amount of meltwater that we will have in the oceans. And we have to we forget this bit of the ocean, and we really have to do all we can to protect that space for as long as we can. And the third bit is something I think that, Karen May, you mentioned about agency, and I do think there's been a massive shift around climate justice. And the understanding, I was there in Paris when we had the negotiations, and of course the small island states and the CARICOMs were really important in getting that across the line. I think this time is even more significant to get real change made. And I would like to ask you about Vanuatu's judgment and opinion that they have, and I know you've been party to it, and New Zealand's been party to it. Because it seems to me at some point there has to be liability and responsibility. And I would love to hear a little more about how you see that as actually being part of the dynamic that maybe could really force more curbs on protections.
Please, I mean, if there's any context you would like to give, do feel free.
Yeah, actually, thanks for raising that case that we currently have before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Seas, where my Prime Minister, Antigua, Barbuda and Vanuatu, have launched this important opinion, a case to get an opinion from the court on liability with respect to that. I think we're still awaiting that opinion, but it's part of a strategy to move the discussion along, that we're seeking to understand if there really is a basis in law for the polluter pays type principles, and it will then, I believe, inform how future discussions around this issue is developed. And so, yes, I think it's important to flag that up, that is actually happening. It's not a grab for money. It is an understanding that our very existence is under threat through actions outside of our own making. And as I said before, without diminishing the importance of that, the parallel to that is that despite the fact that we're not the sort of culprits of climate change or the architects in any shape or form in the smaller islands, we are still doing things like setting national determined contributions. We're still looking at ways to use electric vehicles. We're still looking at ways to reduce our carbon footprint, although it's already negligible. And I think that's an important point just to raise here as well, and thank you for that.
Thank you for that question. We have time for one more. Is there anybody? At the back, please, with the glasses. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for a really interesting talk. Tom Cox from Carbon Pulse. I was just wondering if you could give any key examples of initiatives that your countries are looking forward to engaging with to promote private nature-based solutions in oceans, whether in acidification or elsewhere. Thank you.
Did everyone hear that question?
If you could repeat it.
So I think, would you mind repeating it? I don't want to get your words wrong. Sorry.
Sure. Do you have any key examples of private nature-based solutions in oceans that your countries are looking to encourage?
Private nature-based solutions in the oceans, whether for acidification or for other ocean-based problems. I will vamp for time until someone decides they feel comfortable interjecting. Phil.
Just one small example. Obviously, that you immediately develop an alliance with your seafood industries who are going to be dramatically and awfully affected by the impact of acidification. So we have major export industries and mussels. I should advertise green lip New Zealand mussels. Great for your health, arthritis, etc. So what we call crayfish, and you I think may call lobsters. You know, there's a whole seafood industry there that are a natural partner for us and that will line up with us and demand the same things. And in the New Zealand context, a big part of that industry is an indigenous industry that has relied on what we call kai moana, food from the sea, and they are again natural allies. So what you try to do is you line up with groups like that. They may be coming from different perspectives, but we're all after the same end result. And by building that coalition, you've got far more likelihood of being able to achieve the outcomes you're seeking.
Thank you, Phil. Just to keep things on time, I will end it there. Before I thank the panelists, is there going to be a group photo of the panelists on stage or not? Just the applause can cover that. I just wanted to make sure. No need? Fine. All right, can I have a round of applause for the panelists? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Phil. Thanks very much. All right, the day is almost over. We started with the injunction from Mr. Mitsuki Uno from the Nippon Foundation to stay away, to learn the lessons of ocean ignorance, of ocean obliviousness, and I think these last few hours have definitely been a great way of opening our eyes. And we were asked a few times in different contexts whether people care, and we heard in robust terms that millions of people do and have no choice, and it's incumbent on those of us who maybe feel we have more choice to realize that these problems are coming for us all. We heard from the Secretary General at the beginning that this is an ocean commonwealth. I would go further and say that the world is an ocean commonwealth. We all depend on it for all of the various reasons that we've heard. I cannot help, as somebody who spends a lot of time reading reports, I agree with Karen May absolutely that we have enough reports, and what is important is to implement them, perhaps with the sort of ocean acidification policy capacity that Jesse mentioned that the world desperately needs. And I will reiterate the Secretary General's plea to be part of the solution and no longer part of the problem. I would like to thank once again all of the speakers for being so generous with their time, their expertise, and to you all for joining us today and demonstrating your commitment to be part of that solution. Once again, I would like to thank the Nippon Foundation for supporting the Back to Blue initiative, this event, and our venue partner, the Commonwealth Blue Charter, for providing us with today's space, which I hope you have absolutely no photographic evidence to take with you. Please share your feedback with us, with the team, so that we can continue to improve on our events. On behalf of everyone at Economist Impact as well, I hope you found this afternoon useful. One final announcement. Please do stay for the cocktail reception, which will take place in the Blenheim Saloon, just outside this room, and I'm sure you will join me in thanking the New Zealand High Commission for providing a selection of New Zealand wines for the occasion. I've inquired into the wine list.
Neutral, sustainable wine.
Also, I've inquired into the wine list, identified there is a Trinity Hill Chardonnay, which is perhaps appropriately known for its acidity. I hope you all enjoy the reception. Thank you again for your time.